I was like, one of the most compelling things about solar is not necessarily its sustainability aspect, which is good, but it is the energy independence, right? If you live somewhere where infrastructure isn't good, or it's just not reliable, or you just don't have access to energy, you can have it basically now, right?
A problem that your audience might not be very familiar with is on the African continent, only about 60% of the continent has access to energy, and the energy that they do have access to sometimes might not be very reliable. So there's a very large population, over 600 million, that have that energy gap. So essentially, we're trying to figure out how to get relatively expensive solar equipment to communities, how to finance those, how to make sure that it's affordable for the end users using a combination of grants, subsidies, private. A lot of work really has to go to make sure that you're first of all communicating to the end users, to the community heads, that hey, this is the reason why things have to cost this much, because long term we can sustain this. And it all comes back to what kind of capital can you raise.
Creative and engaging mechanism for your podcast. Consider Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of energy, equity, and empowerment with your co-hosts Victoria Cornelio and Andres Tamez, and another podcaster, Olu. So he's from the Energy Talk, and you'll be able to find that on the blog. But he's here because he's a commercial energy pro by day and a podcast host by passion. We're going to be talking to him about stories from the green sector, what that means, and how we look at bold ideas and how serious storytelling has very, very strong powers for us to talk in this sector. So welcome, Olu.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to talk to a fellow podcaster who gets it, you know?
Exactly. And this might be your best sounding episode as well.
No, this is so fun. So commercial energy pro by day, podcast host by passion. Walk us through that. How did you end up here?
That's a very good one. I think it goes back to my university degree. So my background is actually in petroleum engineering. I had very heavy contracts to what I do right now in the clean energy space, but I graduated into probably one of the worst downturns in the oil and gas sector. So basically there was a massive hiring freeze for entry-level roles. And while trying to brainstorm on what to do with my career, I had a conversation with a nonprofit based in Peril. And they were doing some very interesting work in the sustainability space. And that was my first time really speaking to someone who made a career out of climate change and sustainability. And I was like, I love what these guys are doing. Is there a way for me to switch since I'm having this problem? And that was probably one of the best decisions that I ever made. So the way I made that switch in my career was to start a podcast. I was like, I don't know anybody. Everybody's ignoring my messages. My CV isn't getting anywhere. I'm going to start a podcast. And one thing I discovered is people love being invited on podcasts. They would ignore everything else. But as soon as I say, oh, by the way, would you like to be a guest? They're like, oh, perfect. Yes. So as you can imagine, I made a lot of friends that way. To my surprise, people actually listened to the podcast episodes that we made. That part was a bit unexpected. That started about 6 years now that I've been running the Energy Talk podcast. We're focused on telling the story of Sub-Saharan Africa's energy transition. We cover everything from policy, financing, and operators as well, whether that is private or public companies. And we've been doing that work for a very long time. My career has also followed the progression of the podcast. I've gone from working with a nonprofit, and for the last 4 years, I've been working with startups as a commercial manager. I'm working to deploy and finance sustainable energy projects on the African continent.
Wow, that is so cool. So you were able to fully pivot, blend all your passions into one, and that's what you do. I think that's really inspiring. A lot of people feel stuck when they've chosen a path that suddenly doesn't feel right. So what gave you impulse, you know? How did you find the motivation to do it or the security to do it? Because it can be quite scary.
That's a very good question. And I think it's always been about uh, just kind of the way I'm wired. I think I have a bit of ADHD and I can't really focus on something unless I really, really like doing it. And that has really made a lot of the career decisions I've made very intentional because I want to work on something that's very high impact. And the most high impact thing that I could think of was to be part of the push towards deploying really long-term infrastructure projects that can last like the next 10, 20, 100 years, hopefully. And that was like the key pivot. And one very interesting story how I did this is, as you can imagine, when I first got out of university, I was a broke, unemployed graduate and I had no money. So I had to go to my mom and I wrote her a business plan and asking her for $100 loan to start my podcast. And I was like, this is going to be the thing. I was like, I'm going to stop applying for jobs and I'm going to start this podcast. And this is how I'm going to start my career. So you can imagine it was a bit, it was a bit crazy at that moment. But it actually paid off. I think probably she would say that was a very profitable,
a good investment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of led to everything. And I feel very privileged to be able to do what I do. And it's not very often that you get to truly take a lot of satisfaction in the work that you have to do to survive, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. And how has the podcast helped you sort of shape your own understanding of the clean energy transition?
It's been very instrumental. It's one of the things that has really helped me kind of go beyond just my regular role because I get to speak one-on-one with people who are doing things well beyond my level of experience or exposure. I get it started up pretty small. So I was just speaking to people within my network, people that I found on LinkedIn. Soon after, we started speaking to a lot of CEOs, a lot of financiers, whether that's in the VC space or on the infrastructure asset managers. And it's very interesting to see how different perspectives really come together to solve one particular problem. And then, first of all, it gives you a lot of appreciation for the scale of the challenge. But then it's kind of like introduces you very early to a lot of nuance. I think social media, sometimes if you like, depending on how you get information, you can get like very quick sound bites that sound pretty good, but lack a lot of nuance. Yeah. But it's really hard not to get your positions challenged or to learn something new when you're having a 30 to 1 hour conversation with somebody who is doing something that you haven't done as well. So, professionally, it's been great because it's been an amazing networking tool. But personally, it's really shown me how a lot of appreciation for the work that goes into just setting up a simple power grid, for instance, or setting up a piece of policy, or to launch a simple program, or to raise $1,000 for a youth event in an underrepresented community. The entire spectrum, and I've gotten to meet people, really great people across that.
Yeah, and that's part of your day job as well, right? So working in that commercial energy and deploying infrastructure, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think that's also something else. So usually people tend to pick their hobby and their careers as separate things. Unfortunately, my day job is more of the same. So currently I work as a commercial manager for a startup called Odyssey Energy Solutions. There we directly finance solar mini-grid projects and also EV assets across the African continent. So what that looks like is if a developer, that's what we call companies that actually build these assets. If a developer wants to deploy a fleet of 1,000 two-wheel EVs, that's electric motorcycles, or if they want to build a mini power generation plant that's powered by solar, we would essentially come in, look at the transaction and decide whether or not that we can back that financially. And we do pretty large ticket sizes for that on the infrastructure side. Before this, I was working with an OEM. So that's an original equipment manufacturer. So they essentially made low-cost solar equipment for rural electrification. A problem that your audience might not be very familiar with is on the African continent, only about 60% of the continent has access to energy, and the energy that they do have access to sometimes may not be very reliable. So there's a very large population, over 600 million, that have that energy gap. So essentially, we're trying to figure out how to get relatively expensive solar equipment to communities, how to finance those, how to make sure that it's affordable for the end users using a combination of grants, subsidies, private capital, and some sort of concessional loans. So it's kind of like a like two sides to the same coin, right? You're really driven by the climate change aspect and the end user aspect of trying to make an impact, but then you're dealing with all the commercial sides of the reality that people want to invest money and make a return, and it's very difficult to actually get people to commit capital to things that that might be driven by impact more than profits. But that's where I sit, and it's not always easy, but it's something I get up and do every day.
Yeah, no, and you sound really passionate about it, so I can imagine it really gets you out of bed.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier, that I need to enjoy what I do, and that's why I feel like I'm in the perfect industry.
I was going to ask earlier when you were telling us about your education background. Do you think that your background in petroleum engineering, do you think that gives you is that an asset, especially when you're talking to people on the more renewable energy side? That we have to be honest, a lot of the times we people on one side don't really understand what goes on the other, and the benefits of one side over the other, and so you can see the benefit of traditional energy, right? And
yeah.
how it can be used and leveraged to maybe help sustainability, right? Like, do you think there's an advantage there from your background and the things you know?
Yes, definitely. So first of all, I always make this joke that I probably have the least useful engineering degree, because petroleum engineering, we really focus on how to get oil out of the ground. So that's a lot of work around geology, fluid dynamics, and all of the things that don't really apply to day-to-day life. So in terms of the technical learnings from my engineering degree, it hasn't been very useful in my day-to-day career. But just the engineering training, knowing that how to work with numbers, I think that has translated very well to working with financing, because it's just numbers. You're just like working on returns and risk of certain assets. So there's been some pretty good translation there. But one thing that I think has been even more beneficial is just the appreciation for how complex energy systems are. A lot of people who might just started up on the renewable energy side might think that the oil and gas industry is just completely unnecessary or completely evil or whatever it is. There's a lot of nuance, and I think that the analogy that I like to give is, if you were in a remote community and you've not had power for the last 3 months and you had to do something really important, you wouldn't care if the electricity comes from solar, oil, coal. It could be burning ducks. Like, at that point, you would take anything, right? And we need to understand that, like, for some people, that's their reality. So we're really trying to come up with the best low-cost solution that can meet that need, but also be sustainable long term. The reality right now is that the best means to do that is via solar. That might change in the next few years, but this is the best solution, and we really need to be pushing more on that particular front. So nuance is probably very important. It kind of gives me a big appreciation for the role that other people play in the energy system just outside of the renewable energy sphere, and also just engineering training to know that you can find solutions and you can work with people as well to come to pretty good outcomes.
Why solar? Is it just because of how I think it's very accessible right now, right? Compared to others, which the upfront cost could be a lot larger, right? Like nuclear, for example. Is that one of the main reasons? Like, why is solar the solution?
That's a very good question. And the reason why solar has emerged as such a big solution, especially for developing communities and Africans in particular, or Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is because it allows you to deploy assets in a decentralized manner. The way that the US, the UK, and most other developed nations have built their energy systems is they have a central large power generation unit, and that's usually either coal, most likely coal, natural gas, And that central generation point, you connect all your transmission lines to, and that spreads out the energy across pretty large distances. That works in a lot of developed countries because those infrastructures have been in place for many, many years. But when you come to Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, I'll use Nigeria as an example. The central grid infrastructure is not very good. It's not enough to even facilitate energy to the coverage area. So the ones that already have transmission lines, the ones that have meters in their homes, they're not getting enough from the main grid. So you have an option. Either you expand the central grid, which is very, very expensive. There's a lot of policy that can really tie things up and make it even more expensive on the long term. Or you want to bring in like more complicated technology like nuclear, which has a lot of ramifications that a developing country, quite frankly, might not be technically, socially or politically able to really develop. Solar really comes in as an option that really fits that perfect spot, because the cost of solar equipment has been reducing drastically in the last 10 years. So you have a relatively low cost equipment, and more importantly, it can be deployed in pockets in a decentralized nature. So the industry for solar energy in Africa is called decentralized renewable energy, because you can build relatively small mini grids about like 500 kilowatts to 4 megawatts. These scales might not really mean much to the audience, but just keep that in mind as kind of like an anchor. And you can just spread this out across communities that actually need them, the communities that are actually able to afford them, or communities that have some sort of grant financing that would further reduce the cost of deployment. Because again, if they've not had access to energy for a very long time, most likely the ability to pay for power is also reduced or suppressed. So you need to give them something where they can actually afford to pay, so the people going in, buying the equipment can actually make money. And that's how you get a sustainable infrastructure like landscape that really grows. So there are a lot of more complicated reasons, but just for a snapshot, that's the reason why solar has really grown and continues to grow as the best solution to really close that energy access gap.
That's a really compelling snapshot. Like, one of the things that me and Vic talk about is, I was talking to her the other day, and I was like, one of the most compelling things about solar is not necessarily its sustainability aspect, which is good, but it is the energy independence, right? If you live somewhere where infrastructure isn't good, or it's just not reliable, or you just don't have access to energy, you can have it basically now, right? You just have it shipped to you, kind of your own way of generating electricity.
And I think a lot of times people underestimate how important it is to sell that exact story that you just told, that energy independence, that angle, because I think a lot of times we get inundated with the climate change aspect, which is all very real and it's very important. But again, it really depends on who you're trying to sell to. Someone who needs energy like right now from whatever source, they really care about, is this going to be cheaper than what I'm currently using? Which in most cases is going to be either diesel or petrol for generators. Solar beats that by far, right? So you really want to incentivize them by their biggest pain point. And I think there's been a lot of really good progress from private organizations that really able to do that. And that also contributes to the huge boom that solar has been experiencing, especially in Africa.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you've mentioned policy a couple of times, and I'm just wondering, do you think there's like a gap in understanding between policymakers and the people building these green solutions on the ground? Like, is there something that, they're just not getting it?
So I'll backtrack for your audience, so maybe it'll be easier to follow along. I'm an engineer by training, so I was kind of, my mindset for a very long time is, as far as it technically makes sense and it's economically feasible, why should you not do it, right? Now, as someone who has actually worked for a very long time, I know that there are actually many reasons why, and many valid reasons why. So I have a very much stronger appreciation for the role that policy plays and how complicated it can be to actually set up the right kind of policy. Because a lot of times when it comes to policy, which is basically the rules that the private sector and everybody else has to operate by, a lot of the government officials are very well-meaning. They want to come up with a solution that kind of like serves everybody. But when you're working in a space that you're working with either new technology, new business models, you're working with really complex players within the space, it takes a very long time to get like really good, thoughtful policy laid out. So they need a lot of support. There are lots of organizations that do these kind of support. RMI does a lot of really fantastic work. Sustainable Energy for All does some really fantastic work, because once we have the right policy frameworks in place and everybody knows the rules, then people can like take more risks. Finances can come in and put in more money because you know the boundaries they are working at. I've had a lot of conversations with policymakers, and sometimes they're in a very difficult spot because there's a lot of pressure on them as well. And it's something that, to be honest, I'm still growing a bit of appreciation for, because I sit on the private side, and a lot of times I'm like, they could just move like a little bit faster, like every time. I think for any private operator, the right amount of policy will probably be none. But it's a delicate balance that everybody kind of like has to work together, be collaborative, and long term have rules that are set that not just incentivizes people to go in, make investments, and be beneficial for the end users, but so it's done in a way that is equitable, and you don't have like 5 years, 10 years down the line where you're like, oh wow, this has been a complete and utter failure because these incentives weren't aligned, or there was this loophole that allowed exploitation of the system, or like whatever else.
Yeah, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, right? And within your platform, you talk, like you said, to a lot of high-level people, but what stories do you think aren't being told enough right now in the green sector? What are some conversations we're not having?
I think something that's really powerful for me, and that I have been a bit more intentional about featuring on my podcast, is the private players that are coming into the sector. I think Africa has a lot of stories being told, particularly around aid and grants. And as helpful as that is, because it has been a really good capital pool that's really poured into the continent, not just in energy, but in other social aspects as well, education and health. But it only takes you so far, because the incentives of someone providing donor capital, for instance, might be not aligned with what's needed for a private company to go in and scale, which is why you have loans from banks and VC, for instance, venture capital. But once those options aren't available, you kind of incentivize a different kind of industry to build. But a recent change that's been happening is there's been a lot of more private capital, which means that they're putting in money solely to make back more money. And that's always a good thing, because that means that the sector has very high potential, because then people are seeing this as a way for them to generate returns. And that incentivizes more capital to come in and more players.
It's a healthy market.
Exactly. That is when you can have the capitalist system, for better or worse, work to the benefit of end users. Obviously, there are like lots of caveats to that, but in general, that has been a recent trend that's been emerging, especially from companies being set up focused on climate tech in Africa and being backed by some creative financing from VCs. And the trend there is there's a lot of specialized financiers and investors that are propping up just to support those kind of companies. And that's very exciting for me, because a lot of times local founders and local companies really struggle to get access to capital. And because most of the capital has been concessional or donor-led, they've been pushed in a particular direction. But now they can actually think more about scale, about growth, and about not just filling up for the end user, but growing their organizations. And also it attracts people, right? Because if they see that the sector is growing, more people would want to come in, and that's how you get a healthy ecosystem.
Do you think it's also a thing of long term having a healthy market is just better? Because this is sort of a stereotype, and it sort of exists in my brain about like the sort of aid slash side of things. They'll come in, they'll do something, it's really awesome, but they don't have that long term view of sustaining it, right? Yes, they have a vision, a long-term vision, but they, unlike the private sector, which installs it, and now it has to be generating money basically forever, and so they have a really strong incentive to maintain it. It's different on the other side. Do you think that stereotype is kind of true, that it's just in the long term it might be better?
Yeah, and I'll give an example of how this can play out in the real world. So let's say that I am a private developer, and I want to build a solar mini grid that's 1 megawatt. And just for context, that can serve at least like 1,000 households. So let's say that there's a community of 1,000 households. And that's going to have a beneficiary base of about like 50,000 people across those 1,000 households, right? That's what I want to do. So I go out to the market. I have my plan. I've done my feasibility studies. I have the design for the actual grid. And now I need to raise money to go build it. The kind of capital that I raise affects a lot of decisions that I have to make down the road, right? So let's say that I raise money from a donor, like aid money. So think about USAID, even though they probably don't have any more money to give out, or any other source, and they give me money to build the grid, and they give me really great terms, but they tell me that I can only charge the tariff to the households a certain amount, just so that from their impact reports they can say that the houses are getting affordable energy, and that's perfect. Like, that is a really good intention. But if the amount that I'm charging the households is not enough for me to keep up with the operation and maintenance costs for the grid, after the aid money runs out, which is basically what I need to actually build the asset, if I'm not making enough money from that asset, then long term, it becomes very difficult to justify from a business sense to keep operating that asset. The incentive for me as a developer is to just go build a new one, get the aid money to build it, and then rinse and repeat, because the incentives aren't aligned to actually operate that asset, because there's a cap to how much I can charge, right? And this is where a lot of the nuance gets left out, because if you raise money from a private source, you need to be able to operate that asset profitably. Otherwise, it's not economically viable. And that means that you have to charge more money to the end user. But long term, there's a lot of benefit. So a lot of work really has to go to make sure that you're, first of all, communicating to the end users, to the community heads, that, hey, this is the reason why things have to cost this much, because long term we can sustain this. And it all comes back to what kind of capital can you raise. And I think that kind of, like, I hope that puts like a picture in your audience's mind of why it's important to raise either a certain type of capital or a certain blend of capital, and how it affects long-term decisions that private companies will make, because they have to make those decisions, and it's all based on what incentives they have.
Yeah, I think you explained that really well, because it really does paint that picture. And if we weave in storytelling here, like you said, we have to be able to communicate that. When you look at the green economy today, do you think we're telling the story of opportunity enough, or are we kind of stuck on this crisis narrative?
I feel like there's been a switch, like probably in the last since I became very aware, probably in the last 5 years, there's been a switch on really sounding the alarm on climate change and the large amount of population that aren't being served and don't have access to energy. There was initially like a tone change, I think, in the last 2 to 3 years specifically, where we've changed that story to like, we need to provide aid and help to these communities, to there's an opportunity here to actually make money, right? And tonally, it's very important, because depending on what version of that message you're using, you're going to attract different kind of people. If you say you want to go in and provide like an aid service, right? You'll most likely get volunteers. You get people who want to do some good, really well intentioned, but there's a limit to what they can actually do when they're working on a volunteer basis, right? Mm-hmm. But if you present it as an opportunity, right, you're telling people that, hey, I believe if you invest money in this place, you can build generational wealth. Then you're investing. Then most likely you attract people who are very, very intelligent, young, driven, looking to make an impact, looking to actually work hard and build. And I feel like that tone change has been very important to a lot of local founders and private capital coming into the space, because long term, with the analogy I gave earlier, you can see how it affects on a 10 to 20 year scale. So all these things also compound.
And so I like that you mentioned that. So that attracts the local money, right? That attracts the local interest. Would you say that that's way more important than a lot of these, like to the long-term viability of it, right? Because it seems like it would be.
Yes.
You have people that care about the community in a way.
Yeah. So one thing that I think it's always good for people to keep in mind is that capital only cares about returns. I think like once you come to terms with that, I feel like a lot of things would probably fall off your back a bit easier. But there is a right blend, and the structure that's emerging as preferred within the energy/climate tech ecosystem in Africa is what's called blended finance funds. So that is when you have some sort of concessional loan. So let's say you get a grant or you get like a low interest loan, like below market rates, really great deal. And in some cases, they can be forgiven. You attract some sort of private capital, and then you attract like a blend of debt or whatever it is. Right. So that basically allows you to deploy money into assets that are deemed risky or more risky than traditional assets, and allow you to, based on what the return expectation is. Because if you're a grant provider, for instance, you really don't expect to make any of your money back, right? So you can like just give that money, get your impact report, and the impact report is basically your return because that's what you care about. But if you're a private capital provider, you want to make like 5 to 20%, whatever it is, on the money you put in. So you have that expectation going in, right? So what blended finance funds really do, it allows you to pull money from a lot of different players and meet them where their return profile is and make sure that everybody gets what they want while still deploying money into quote unquote more risky private assets. So that way you can back founders, you can back local teams, you can back teams that probably don't have a lot of track record, rather than consolidating capital and what will be the bigger, less risky enterprises.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then looking ahead, what narratives do we need to amplify if we're going to, accelerate a just and sustainable transition that you're talking about?
I think for me, right, the narrative that at least I try to push, I'm not sure, depending on who you ask, the answers might be very vastly different, is I like to focus on the people who are actually out there doing it. I think that's something that I kind of caught myself on, is because I'm so deep on the weeds on these things. I've been in the industry for so long. I assume everybody knows, like, the people who are doing well. But really, like, there's kind of like a lid that the industry news doesn't really break through. But when you have like a Nigerian founder whose company has raised a 50 million Series B round, right? You want to celebrate those stories because those stories are very rare. When you have 10 companies tackling climate change within Africa, you want to make sure that they're able to get enough visibility for them to go raise their seed rounds. Or if you have a developer that wants to build a mini grid in a community that's been overlooked for many years, you want to make sure that they're able to have the right kind of visibility to go out and raise the kind of money that they need. So that's kind of the work that I've been focused on my podcast, really trying to amplify the right voices, trying to make sure that we celebrate the wins we have, because the people working really hard in these sectors. And for me, that's kind of narrative that really makes me happy. And by default, like, I want to have more of them, like, any chance I can get on my podcast.
I love that. Well, and we'll be linking the podcast on the blog section. We're going to stay on with Olu for a couple more minutes, talk about some more technical things, and you can check out that blog at tangeliclife.org. But thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to hear you so passionate and so driven. And you explain things that are very technical really well. So I commend you for that, because that can be quite hard. So we'll catch you guys on the next one. Make sure to check out the Energy Talk if you want more sustainable green energy, green sector content. And we'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.